My son built something extraordinary from nothing. I watched him do it with my own two eyes, working from the kitchen table of my old house in Columbus, Ohio, surviving on instant noodles and black coffee, while I worried myself half to death about his health. He was 26 years old when he wrote the first line of code for what would eventually become a cloud security platform, serving over 300 corporate clients across the country. I was a retired electrical engineer who barely understood what cloud security meant, but I understood my son. I understood what it cost him. I understood what it was worth. His name was Nathan, and he was everything I had left after his mother passed from ovarian cancer when he was 19. I raised him on discipline and honesty, and the belief that the right thing to do is rarely the easy thing. He absorbed those lessons better than I ever expected. He was sharper than me, kinder than me, and more patient than any young man I had ever known. When he told me at 31 that his company, ClearVault Technologies, had reached a valuation of $18 million, I did not celebrate with champagne. I sat down in my recliner and cried like a child, because I knew his mother would have been so proud she could not have stood it. What I did not know then, what I could not have imagined, was that Nathan had quietly been fighting something far more dangerous than market competition for years. And I did not find out until it was too late to fight it beside him. He was diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia in the spring of 2 years ago. He did not tell me for 3 months. When he finally drove up from Cincinnati to sit across from me at my kitchen table, he looked thinner than I remembered, and there was a stillness in his eyes that told me the news before his mouth did. He said he had already begun treatment. He said his oncologist was optimistic. He reached across the table and gripped my hand and told me he was not ready to go anywhere. I believed him because I needed to, and because Nathan had never in his life told me something he did not mean. The next 14 months were a war. Chemotherapy, remission, relapse, experimental treatment, more hope, more waiting. I drove down to Cincinnati every 2 weeks, sometimes every week. I sat in hospital waiting rooms, reading magazines I had no interest in, while nurses I would come to know by name checked his blood work and adjusted his drip lines. His assistant, a young woman named Priya, who had worked beside him for 4 years, kept the business running with a steadiness that amazed me. She called me every Friday to give me an update, not just on Nathan's health, but on the company, because Nathan had asked her to keep me informed. I did not fully understand why at the time. I thought it was simply because he wanted me to feel included. I was wrong about that. What I also did not know during those 14 months was that a man named Marcus Webb had been watching. He had been waiting. Marcus had been Nathan's college roommate at Ohio State. They had been close in the way that young men who share ambition sometimes become close competitive but bonded, pushing each other. When Nathan started ClearVault, Marcus was the first person he brought on. They worked together for nearly 3 years. In that time, Marcus contributed to the early architecture of the platform, handled some of the initial client outreach, and positioned himself carefully as co-founder in every conversation that could benefit him. What Marcus never told anyone outside that early circle was how it ended. Nathan had discovered that Marcus was negotiating privately with a rival firm, sharing proprietary code samples in exchange for a job offer and an equity stake in a competing product. Nathan had the receipts, emails, screenshots, a paper trail that Marcus had been careless enough to leave intact. When Nathan confronted him, Marcus did not deny it. He simply calculated that he had more to gain by leaving than by fighting. They reached a buyout agreement. Marcus took a cash settlement, signed a non-compete clause, and walked away from ClearVault with enough money to start a digital marketing consultancy that he ran with middling success for the next several years. He signed away every claim to ClearVault, every single one. Nathan had been meticulous about it, but that was 7 years before Nathan got sick. And 7 years is a long time for a man like Marcus Webb to watch someone else's company grow and convince himself that he deserved a share of it. Nathan passed on a Tuesday morning in October. I was there. Priya was there. His oncologist, Dr. Fowler, was there. It was quiet, and it was dignified, and it was the single worst morning of my 63 years. I held his hand and I talked to him, even after he stopped responding, because I could not bring myself to stop. I told him I was proud of him. I told him his mother was waiting. I told him that whatever he had built would not be wasted. The funeral was 4 days later. About 200 people came, former clients, employees, people from his neighborhood, people I had never met who told me that Nathan had mentored them or supported their work or simply been kind to them when they needed it. I stood at the front of that room for 3 hours, shaking hands and nodding, and holding myself together through sheer force of will. I was 63 years old, and I had buried my wife, and now my only child, and I was not going to fall apart in public. Marcus Webb came to the funeral. I recognized him from photographs Nathan had shown me years earlier, before the falling out. He was 41, well-dressed in the way that men dress when they want to project success they are not entirely sure of. He shook my hand with both of his and looked at me with an expression of practiced grief, and said that Nathan had been one of the most talented people he had ever known. I thanked him without knowing who he was. Priya, standing nearby, went very still when she saw him. She caught my eye, but said nothing. She found me 2 days later. She came to my house in Columbus on a Thursday afternoon and sat at the same kitchen table where Nathan had told me about his diagnosis. She set a manila envelope on the table between us, and she folded her hands and she looked at me the way someone looks at you when they are about to say something that will change the shape of your day. She told me about Marcus. She told me the full history, the betrayal, the buyout, the non-compete. She told me that in the weeks before Nathan died, when he was still lucid and still working from his hospital bed because he could not help himself, he had made a series of very deliberate decisions. He had updated his estate documents. He had consolidated ownership of Clearvault into a trust. He had left a sealed letter with his attorney, a woman named Carol Simmons, with instructions that it be opened in the event that anyone challenged the estate. And he had given Priya a separate packet of documents, originals, not copies, with instructions to deliver them to me if she ever saw Marcus Webb at his funeral. She had seen Marcus Webb at his funeral. I opened the envelope. Inside was a 22-page document that Nathan had clearly assembled over months, possibly longer. It was a meticulous, organized record. The original buyout agreement with Marcus's signature, the non-compete clause in full, the email exchanges documenting Marcus's theft of proprietary materials, and a notarized letter from Nathan written in his own voice describing the circumstances of the separation and his reasons for believing that Marcus Webb might one day attempt to claim a stake in Clearvault once the company's value became public knowledge. At the bottom of the last page, in Nathan's handwriting, was a note addressed to me. "Dad, if you're reading this, Priya did exactly what I asked. I'm sorry I couldn't warn you in person. I didn't want to spend our last months talking about Marcus Webb. I wanted to talk about other things. Everything you need is here. Trust Carol. Trust Priya. Don't let him have what we built. I love you." I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after Priya left. Then I called Carol Simmons. She was not surprised to hear from me. She had been expecting the call. She told me that Marcus Webb had already reached out to her office, not to offer condolences, but to inquire about the structure of Nathan's estate and whether there were any outstanding claims from early company stakeholders. She had not given him any information, but she said the inquiry told her everything she needed to know about his intentions. 11 days after Nathan's funeral, I received a letter from a law firm in Cleveland. It was addressed to me as executor of Nathan's estate. The letter informed me that Marcus Webb was asserting a claim of co-founder equity in Clearvault Technologies on the basis that the original company had been built, in part, through his intellectual contributions, that the buyout agreement he had signed was executed under duress and without adequate legal counsel, and that he was prepared to pursue litigation to recover what he called his rightful share of the company's current value. I read that letter 3 times. Then I set it on the table and I thought about Nathan working through his first round of chemotherapy, sitting up in a hospital bed organizing documents because he knew this was coming. He had been sick and exhausted and fighting for his life, and he had still thought ahead, still prepared, still protected what he had built. I called Carol. We met in her office the following Monday morning. She was 50-something, methodical, with the kind of quiet confidence that tells you a person has been in difficult rooms before and has never once left without a plan. She reviewed the claim letter, reviewed Nathan's documents, and outlined what we were facing. Marcus was arguing constructive fraud, that the buyout had been coercive. It was a thin argument, she said, but thin arguments filed with the right language in the right court could create months of delay and legal expense that some estates could not sustain. That was likely his real strategy. Attrition. He did not necessarily expect to win outright. He expected to cost me enough time and money that I would negotiate a settlement just to make it stop. I told Carol I was not interested in settling for a single dollar. She smiled and said good, because we had something better than a settlement. We had Nathan. Marcus's legal team filed suit in December. The claim was built on 3 arguments: co-founder status, inadequate compensation at buyout, and what his attorneys called ongoing contributed intellectual property, the idea that early code Marcus had written was still embedded in the current platform. That last argument was the most dangerous because it was the hardest to disprove quickly. Software development is not always clean. Lines of code written 7 years ago by a 20-something with access to the core architecture could theoretically have persisted. Priya handled that part. She had anticipated it. In the 3 weeks between Nathan's death and the filing, she had commissioned an independent technical audit of the ClearVault codebase, tracing every architectural component to its original author. She had done it on her own initiative, paid for it out of operating funds she had authority to use, and the results were definitive. Not one significant component of the current platform could be traced to Marcus Webb. The early work he had contributed had been entirely replaced and rewritten, in some cases multiple times, as the company scaled. It existed now only in archive backups that were themselves evidence that the platform had evolved completely beyond anything he had touched. The technical audit cost $11,000, and it effectively dismantled 1/3 of Marcus's case before we had set foot in a courtroom. His attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had the kind of silver-haired presentation that was designed to project authority in depositions, attempted to challenge the audit's methodology during preliminary proceedings. He argued that the auditor had a conflict of interest because of his relationship with ClearVault. Carol presented the auditor's credentials, his independence, and 4 prior cases in which his analysis had been accepted as expert testimony. The challenge went nowhere. But the deposition is where things became something else entirely. Marcus sat across a conference table from Carol and me in February, 4 months after Nathan's funeral. He was composed. He had prepared. His attorney had coached him well, and he answered questions with the careful precision of a man who has rehearsed his story until it sounds like memory. He described the early days of ClearVault with what I can only call selective nostalgia, emphasizing his contributions, softening his departure, reimagining the timeline of events in ways that made the buyout sound rushed and the non-compete sound like something Nathan had slipped into a stack of papers without explanation. Carol let him talk. She asked calm, open questions and let him build his version of events. Then she placed the emails on the table. She placed them one by one, dated and printed, the thread of messages Marcus had sent to the competing firm over the course of 6 weeks, attaching files labeled with ClearVault's internal project names. His face did not change exactly, but something behind it did. There was a recalibration happening behind his eyes that I recognized as the moment a man realizes the story he has been telling has just been disassembled in front of him. He said he did not recall those communications. His attorney objected to the framing of the question. Carol moved forward without adjusting her pace at all. She placed the response emails from the competing firm. She placed the job offer, dated 3 weeks before Marcus left ClearVault, with a compensation package that included equity in the competing product. She placed a message in which Marcus had written in his own words that he was confident he could bring additional proprietary materials when he transitioned. Fitch called a recess. They were in the hallway for 40 minutes. When they came back, Marcus was quieter. He gave shorter answers. He stopped trying to embroider. Carol asked him whether, at any point before signing the buyout agreement, he had consulted an attorney. He said he had not had time. She placed the invoice from an Ohio business attorney dated 2 days before the buyout signing, billing Marcus Webb for 4 hours of contract review. He said he did not remember that. She placed the email Marcus had sent to that attorney, confirming the appointment and attaching the draft agreement. The deposition ended shortly after. The weeks that followed were not quiet. Fitch filed a motion to suppress the emails on the grounds that they had been obtained improperly. Carol filed a response, demonstrating that Nathan had preserved them as business records at the time of Marcus's departure, that they had been disclosed properly in discovery, and that there was no legal basis for suppression. The motion was denied. Fitch then attempted to reframe the suit as a breach of fiduciary duty claim, arguing that Nathan had leveraged Marcus's mistakes to extract an unfair settlement. That argument required him to simultaneously admit that his client had attempted to steal proprietary materials, while arguing that the response to that theft had been disproportionate. The judge, a woman named Patricia Howell, who had clearly seen every variety of legal gymnastics in her career, listened to the argument with visible patience, and then issued a ruling that was 14 pages long and left no ambiguity about where she stood. She found that the buyout agreement was valid, that it had been entered into with full legal counsel on both sides, and that Marcus Webb had no cognizable claim to any equity in Clearvault Technologies. She further referred the matter to the State Bar for review of whether Fitch's filings had crossed the line into frivolous litigation. But that was not the end of it. Not quite. 2 weeks after Judge Howell's ruling, Carol received a call from an investigator at the Ohio Secretary of State's office. Someone had filed paperwork attempting to register a variation of the Clearvault name as a new business entity, Clearvault Consulting LLC, with Marcus Webb listed as the managing member. It was a clumsy move, the kind of thing that looks like a last resort, an attempt to create confusion in the market, and possibly siphon clients who might not notice the difference. The filing used language that implied a historical connection to the original company. It also directly violated the non-compete clause Marcus had signed 7 years earlier. Carol filed a complaint the same afternoon. The Secretary of State's office flagged the registration for review. Fitch, apparently realizing his client had just handed us a separate and much cleaner legal action, withdrew the Clearvault Consulting filing within 72 hours. But the attempt had been documented. It existed in the public record, and it established a pattern of behavior that would matter very much in what came next. Because Carol had been building towards something. She had not told me the full scope of it until she was ready. That was her way. She did not speculate. She did not raise expectations. She moved forward quietly until the picture was complete. In March, 6 months after Nathan's death, she sat down with me and walked me through what she and Priya had assembled. Nathan's sealed letter, opened after the suit was filed, contained not just a narrative account of Marcus's conduct, but a timeline. It documented 2 prior incidents that had not been part of the original buyout proceedings. A conversation in which Marcus, in the months before his departure, had approached a Clearvault client independently and attempted to negotiate a side arrangement for consulting services using his internal access to that client's data, and a second incident in which he had copied Clearvault's entire client database to a personal drive. Nathan had discovered both incidents within days of each other. They were what had finally prompted the confrontation. He had not included them in the buyout proceedings because at the time, his priority was removing Marcus cleanly and quickly, not exposing him publicly. He had been 29 years old and more interested in protecting his company than in punishment. He had, however, documented everything, because that was the kind of person Nathan was. Carol took the full package, the emails, the client database incident, the independent contact with the Clearvault client, and the recent Clearvault Consulting registration attempt to the district attorney's office. They opened an investigation. Marcus was indicted in April on charges of trade secret misappropriation, computer fraud, and attempted fraudulent registration. The indictment was sealed initially, and I was not allowed to discuss it publicly. I sat with that knowledge for 3 weeks, in my house in Columbus, watching the news and reading books and calling Carol every 4 or 5 days to ask if anything had changed. The morning the indictment was unsealed, my phone rang at 7:45. It was Carol. She told me in the calm, even voice she used for everything that Marcus Webb had turned himself in to federal authorities at 8 o'clock that morning, that his attorney was negotiating a plea, and that the lead prosecutor on the case had told her privately that the documentation was as clean and comprehensive as anything she had seen in a case of this type. I thanked Carol. I hung up the phone. I walked out to the back porch of my house, the same porch where Nathan and I had sat 100 times over the years, drinking coffee and arguing about football and talking about his mother. The Ohio spring was doing what it always does in April temperature that cannot make up its mind, sky that looks like it is considering something. I stood there for a while. I thought about a 26-year-old kid at a kitchen table with a laptop and a thermos of coffee. I thought about 14 months of hospital waiting rooms. I thought about a 22-page document assembled by a dying man who had still been thinking clearly enough to protect the people he loved. I did not cry. I had done my crying. I just stood there and let the morning be what it was. Marcus accepted a plea agreement in June. He admitted to trade secret misappropriation and computer fraud. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, ordered to pay restitution, and permanently barred from any business involving software development or technology consulting. His attorney released a statement calling the sentence disproportionate. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, noted that the defendant had not only committed the original offenses, but had subsequently attempted to exploit the death of his former partner to extract financial gain from a grieving family. She called it a compounded betrayal and said the sentence reflected the full weight of that. I was in the courtroom. I did not stand up and say anything. I did not need to. Nathan had already said everything, from 4 pages of carefully organized evidence, from a sealed letter written in a hospital bed, from the work he had done every day of his professional life to build something honest and lasting. In the months that followed, I worked with Priya and the board of ClearVault to establish something Nathan had mentioned to me once, in passing during his illness, a foundation. He had said it almost casually, the way he said things that mattered most, like he was thinking out loud rather than making a declaration. He said he had always wanted to support young engineers from low-income backgrounds who had the talent but not the resources to build anything. He said the loneliest he had ever felt in his early career was not having anyone who could show him how the business side worked, someone who had been there before. We called it the Nathan Cole Foundation. The first cohort of recipients was 8 young people from Ohio and Kentucky, each receiving a 2-year mentorship stipend and access to ClearVault's network of advisors. Priya runs it alongside her operational role. We announced it at a small event in Cincinnati in October, on the 1-year anniversary of Nathan's passing. About 60 people came. I stood at the front of that room and I looked at 8 young faces who had no idea yet what they were capable of, and I thought about what Nathan would have said to them. I said it for him. I told them that the most dangerous thing in any industry is not competition. It is the assumption that what someone else built should be yours because you were nearby when it started. I told them that documentation is not paranoia, it is respect for your own work. I told them that the people who try to take what you have built will always underestimate what you have prepared, because they are motivated by greed, and greed makes people careless. I told them that Nathan had been the most careful person I had ever known, and that carefulness had protected everything. I told them to build something their parents would be proud of, and to document every step. There are things I think about now, in the quieter moments of a house that has been quiet for too long. I think about the phone call I got from Marcus's former assistant, a young woman who had worked for him for 2 years before his indictment and had not known the full story of what he had done at ClearVault. She called me to apologize on his behalf, which was unnecessary but kind. She told me that in the weeks between the judgment and the sentencing, Marcus had told her that he had always believed Nathan would settle, that he had always assumed the estate would find it easier to write a check than to fight. He had counted on grief making me weak. I think about Nathan sitting in his hospital bed knowing that, knowing exactly how Marcus thought, knowing exactly what kind of man he was dealing with and building his response accordingly, quietly, without drama, without anger that I could ever see, just methodically assembling the truth and putting it somewhere it could not be ignored. My son was 34 years old when he died. He had built a company worth $18 million, mentored dozens of people, earned the loyalty of a team that fought for his legacy without being asked, and still found the time, in the last months of his life, to protect his father from a man he had already beaten once before. I am 64 now. I still live in the house in Columbus. I still drink my coffee on the back porch when the weather allows. I run the Nathan Cole Foundation's Board of Advisors, and I review the mentorship applications myself, every one of them, because Nathan would have wanted me to know each of those names. ClearVault Technologies is not mine. I am not a tech man, and I never pretended to be. Priya runs it, with the board, with the same steady hands she had the whole time. It has grown since Nathan died. I find that fitting. I find that exactly right. I have thought sometimes about what I would say to Marcus Webb if I ever saw him again. I do not have an answer to that. I do not think I need one. The case record says what needed to be said. Nathan's documents say what needed to be said. The foundation says the rest. What I know is this. Men like Marcus Webb operate on a particular assumption. They assume that the people who build things are builders, that their energy is in the creation, not the protection. They assume that grief and age and quiet living make a man easier to take from. They assume that if they wait long enough, the paperwork dissolves, and the memory fades, and the story can be rewritten. What they never account for is a son who knew exactly who they were, who kept every email, who wrote 22 pages from a hospital bed, who trusted his father enough to leave him the tools to finish the fight. I did not build Clearvault. Nathan built it. But I finished the fight. And I will tell you honestly, standing in that courthouse, watching a man who had bet everything on my son's grief walk out of that room in handcuffs, I have never felt my son more present than I did in that moment. Not in the foundation events, not at the anniversary, not even standing on that back porch in April. In that courthouse, I felt him exactly the way I felt him when he was 26 and working at my kitchen table and would look up sometimes and catch me watching him and grin and shake his head like he thought I was worrying over nothing. Maybe he was right. Maybe he had it handled the whole time. I think he probably did. If you have children, hold them close. Tell them to document everything. Tell them the work they do is worth protecting not because of what it costs, but because of what it represents, the hours, the discipline, the belief in something that does not yet exist. Tell them that the people who try to take it will always underestimate one thing: how much of themselves a builder puts into what they build, and how far that love travels, even after they are gone. Nathan's love traveled all the way to a federal courthouse in Columbus, Ohio, 14 months after his death, carried in a manila envelope by a woman who had promised him she would deliver it. That is the most extraordinary thing I have ever witnessed, and I am a man who watched his son build something extraordinary from nothing.